Is this a turning point? KT McFarland joins us right now. Ramadi fell to ISIS in an embarrassing defeat for the Iraqi army back in May. Will we be able to take Ramadi back, KT?
Well, you know, we'll have to see. I talked to one American military officer who had been in the Middle East and in that part of the world quite recently, and he said that a lot of the apartments and a lot of the buildings are booby-trapped and mined. It could be a very brutal door-to-door, street-to-street fighting, and there are a number of civilians who are now caught between ISIS and the Iraqi army, so time will tell. But, Jo Ling, here's what I think is the reality in the Middle East today, and it's two things. One, Iraq, the Iraq that we think of, the unified Iraq, that really doesn't exist anymore. In the north, there are the Kurds. In the middle are the Sunnis, and in the southeast are the Shiites. And the reality is every group will fight to defend itself and its own territory and reclaim its own territory, but none of those three groups will fight for the others.
Well, you mentioned,
and that's a significant problem.
That significant problem that points to some serious statistical changes. ISIS has lost 14% of that territory in Iraq and Syria over the past year. So what would a win in Ramadi mean in the overall fight against ISIS?
Well, Jo Ling, it will depend on who's doing the winning in Ramadi. Is it going to be an Iraqi army that has Kurds and Shiites and Sunnis in it? Are they all participating? Are the militias from these countries participating? If so, then maybe it's an indication that I'm wrong, that Iraq really is a unified country where it does have those three major groups, the Kurds, the Sunnis, and Shiites, who are willing to fight with each other, for each other. I'm skeptical, but we will wait and see. The other reality, though, I think is important, is that we keep hearing this stuff about the Islamic State. It's a terrorist group. Yeah, it is absolutely a terrorist group, but it's also a functioning nation state. It has boundaries. It has a military that's well-equipped.
Serious
it's a
revenue.
Wealthy country. Yeah.
Well, moving on from there, KT, you know, everyone's been focused on ISIS for good reason, of course, but the Taliban is claiming responsibility for one of the deadliest attacks against American forces in Afghanistan in 3 years, when one of its suicide bombers drove a motorcycle packed with explosives into an airbase and killing 6 American service members, including 1 woman. Take a listen to Secretary of Defense Ash Carter just a few days before the attack.
The national security of both of our nations remains very much at stake. The Taliban's advances in some parts of the country, even if only temporary, underscore that this is a tough fight, and it's far from over.
KT, how big of a setback is this in Afghanistan? Are Taliban forces continuing to seize that territory across Afghanistan, according to your sources?
Yeah, I mean, not only are they seizing territory across the country, but it's in parts of the country where the Taliban was not thought to have been in the past. You know, every time I've gone to Afghanistan, there's always a saying. You meet Afghans, and they'll tap their wrist and they'll say, "You've got the watches, you Americans, we've got the time." In other words, you may have all the technology, but you're on a schedule, you're on a timeline. We Afghans, we live here, and you're going to be long gone, and we're still going to be stuck fighting it out. And I think that's what we're now seeing. The United States, even though we're going to leave some kind of residual force for a while, we're essentially leaving Afghanistan. The Taliban's going to come in. I predict there'll be much more bloody fighting in a civil war that will go on.
Well, yeah, you make a very fair point there. The U.S. and NATO combat missions ended last year in Afghanistan, but the forces have had this very difficult time that you've referred to. The Obama administration, meanwhile, even has thought about reversing plans to withdraw troops this year. They chose to leave that 9,800 American troops you just talked about in Afghanistan through at least 2016. So overall, do you see in 2016 the battle intensifying?
Yeah, and I think that ultimately we're going to leave. You know, Afghanistan, why is Afghanistan important to us? Well, it's important to us because the Taliban had housed al-Qaeda 15 years ago when they attacked the United States. That was 15 years ago. You know, the Taliban may come back, but al-Qaeda, they've moved on. They've moved on to greener pastures. They've even modified and turned into ISIS and the Islamic State and other terrorist groups. So I look at the situation in Afghanistan. The United States has limited resources. We can't be everywhere. We can't fight everybody all the time. I think Afghanistan is one of those countries where we try to impose democracy, but at the end of the day, we're propping up leaders who don't like us in countries that don't matter. I would rather take American resources and put them in other parts of the Middle East where the fight against ISIS really is an existential threat.
Well, it continues to be a bed of instability there. But we also want to ask you about U.S. Army Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl. He disappeared in Afghanistan 6 years ago, held by the Taliban for 5 years. He made his initial court appearance at Fort Bragg, North Carolina today. He deferred his plea to charges of desertion and misbehavior. KT, what do you think?
Well, I think that I credit the United States Army and the officials in the United States Army, our military leaders, for taking a gutsy move. They're trying him. They know the administration had celebrated Bergdahl. The administration had claimed the Bergdahl release and prisoner swap was a great victory for the administration. And I think the Army is showing some real guts. They're standing up and saying, look, you know, we got an army to run, and we think he's a deserter, and we're going to put the full force of military justice against him. I also think, though, that, Jo Ling, it speaks to the kind of disconnect the administration, and particularly the president, has with his armed forces. You know, it's a contemptuous thing where you take Bowe Bergdahl. They knew that he was a traitor. They knew that the military units he served with had real questions about him, but yet they had the prisoner swap. They celebrated it as a great victory. They brought Bowe Bergdahl's parents to the Rose Garden for a great ceremony. They don't do that for other military leaders or military heroes. And then finally, the swap puts 5 Gitmo prisoners back into the fight. The fact that we've had a suicide bombing today or yesterday in Afghanistan where Americans have died, you got to wonder, are we really releasing Gitmo prisoners to go back into the fight to kill Americans?
All right, KT McFarland, thank you so much for joining us. Always great analysis. Thanks again for joining us on this holiday week.